Awesome. All right. Welcome, everyone. So this is the sig-auth meeting for July 22nd, 2020. We have a light agenda, so we might get some of our time back. So I'll go ahead and get started. So the first issue I had made a little while ago, I think. Um, let's see. So I wrote down some thoughts. We had discussed this, I don't know, like maybe a month and a half ago, something like that. It's been a while. And then I finally actually wrote down the thoughts in my head. Um, have folks had a chance to sort of read this? Have some thoughts, ideas?
So, are is the current proposal to create 3 different TTL fields?
I listed 2 options, and then
Okay.
James was like, "I want all the options at the same time."
Okay.
um, uh,
I just want to understand where we currently think we are with the proposal.
yeah, so I think I personally would be happy in either of these, or the technically the third option, which James suggested, which was in both places. Um, um, I don't know. I would feel like there needs to be a pretty strong reason if we don't want to specify the same thing multiple places. I mean, like take the minimum or something. It's a little hard to reason about. Uh, I'm curious what you mean here, Jordan, about it being backwards incompatible.
So today, if a signer sees a request for a cert and it has its own duration configured, so it says, I issue certs for a year,
Yep.
and it's written to the existing API.
Yep.
And then in the next release, we add a way for a client to say, I would like a cert valid for a week. It sounded like what you were suggesting is if the signer tried to issue that cert for a year, we would reject that issuance. And that's not backwards compatible.
So I would actually say that that would be the correct behavior, right? Because even though the signer fails, the user's intent is correctly honored in the sense that they're not given something longer than they asked for.
I would like to find the user who would thank you for that behavior.
Remember, though, the only reason that you put in like the duration is you're asking for it. By default, it's unset. So like by default, no user gets broken until they ask to be possibly broken.
I think both the request and the recommendation have to remain hints. It's up to the signer to determine the duration.
So of the particular variations of the user requested in the CSR spec, the approver asserts some thing as the, I guess, max. And obviously the signer already has a max. Where do folks land on the buckets of where it makes sense?
I don't think
I
there's
think
a
it's.
reason.
I was going to say, I think it's fine for a client to suggest an expiration and leave it up to the signer to be the decider. More than that, I'm skeptical.
I feel like that's pretty typical behavior for other PKIs as well.
So were those 2 last comments saying that it should be a field in spec, and we don't, the approver doesn't, the approver is approving the spec but doesn't assert a behavior, I guess.
Even without special support, the approver can still refuse to approve something if it doesn't like how long the TTL is, right?
Yeah. I don't see a reason for the signer to indicate anything in the API other than like here's the result.
I agree with that. Basically, if we only have the spec and the signer aspects, then you have to bake all policy that knows about particular requesters into the signer. That was my only thinking of letting that be part of the approval process. The approver seems more likely to be doing things specific to the requester, since it's presumably making sure the requester should be allowed to have this cert. So I don't feel that strongly about it.
Jordan, do you feel comfortable in the fact that if it is just in spec, you could still have like an admission webhook enforce a policy saying that I see a CSR coming from Mo, and Mo likes to do crazy things, so I'll make sure he can't have a really long cert by forcibly setting the field on the way in.
You could do it in admission. I think if CSRs are used by nodes as part of cluster bring up, you might have a hard time putting
Avoiding
a
a
webhook
chicken
on
and
CSRs if you're intending to self-host that webhook.
Yeah.
People do crazy stuff in static pods.
And I salute them.
It's not called out in this doc, but that was actually one interesting first upstream use case for this field might be to have the kubelet understand when it has rotation enabled and turn down its TTL. Sorry, there may be a future proposal, but that was one of the use cases.
If it's handling its own request and decides to set its own TTL, I don't think there's an issue there. I think the concern was just if you had an admission webhook on it and you needed it to be able to get everything up, to be able to read the pod to serve your admission webhook, weird stuff happens.
Yeah.
Okay. Is anyone strongly against an addition to like spec that says I don't know if it's duration or TTL or TTL hint or something obviously describing the lifetime.
Not after hint.
Not a duration. Huh?
Duration hint, not after hint. Whatever.
Yeah, like a not after hint.
Yeah.
Okay. So follow the CSR, the standard PKI variation of the names.
I guess that CSR pins to, or X509 pins to a particular date, and for here we'd probably want it to be a duration. Yeah. So.
You sure you want a duration that would then be calculated based off of the not before on the cert?
Or the creation timestamp of the CSR.
I want to ask for a cert that will be valid for a week. That's what I want.
Okay. And if I don't get to signing it for a week and then I sign it, should it be good for another week?
Yes.
Or...
Because if I ask for it to be valid for a week and it takes you 6 days to sign it, then I didn't get a cert that's valid for a week.
I mean, yeah, it's fair. I don't necessarily feel strongly. I just want some vague idea of this.
I mean, the flags that we passed to the signer today are duration flags because that's how it makes sense to express, like, how long do you want to issue certs for? Like, how long should they be valid? I think something similar from the client's perspective makes sense.
Okay.
That also, from a client's perspective, that lets them formulate the CSR they're going to request and not have to tweak it to like bump the time every time they submit that request.
Yeah. I'm trying to think, like, I guess then if you had an approver say, like, yeah, for 3 days, you're assuming that decision is made not based on absolute time.
I don't see how it can be. Like, the signer is asynchronous. So from the time I approve, like today, I say approve this, and then the signer signs it for some duration. Like, I don't know how long it's going to take for the signer to get to it. So I don't have a firm end date in mind as an
You're
approval
assuming
day.
one mode of it, though, right? Like, as opposed to I'm an approver, I know that Mo's last day at work is in 2 days, and I'm going to give it to him, but only for 2 days. Specifically, the 2 days until he's gone.
Yeah, ultimately it comes to the question of, if we are asking for a duration, when does the clock start ticking on that duration? When it's submitted, when it's approved, when it's signed.
Yep. Well, David, why does it have to be me that's got the last day?
All
I
right.
like when it's submitted because that makes sense to the user. The user at a certain time said, give me a cert that's good for 7 days. It wasn't give me a futures contract for a cert that's good for 7 days sometime next year.
Yeah. I'm willing to argue that out on an API PR.
Yeah.
Okay, so next steps, are folks happy with a change to the existing certificates kept to add the proposed behavior, and then we just, like I said, indefinitely on that PR until we're happy, and merge, and then can change it?
That seems fine to me.
Sounds good to me.
Sure.
Okay. A little sad that James is not here, but I think he's on PTO. I'd kind of like to hear his opinion. But I'll tag him on the PRs and stuff, so that way he can chime in too.
Okay.
All right. I think Tim and Jay, you guys have the next 2 items. You want to introduce it?
Yeah, I'll let Jay take it.
Cool.
Sure, I'll get my, let me see if I can, yeah, there we go. I think I'm out of shadow now. Hi, I'm Jay Beal. I'm one of the leads of the security audit working group. And I'm here to talk to you all about our request to turn into a SIG security. So this is perfect. Mo, I can share my screen, or if you want to keep that, if you want to keep the charter up, that'd be perfect. Which would you like? Do you want me to share, or do you want to drive?
I can just leave it up, no problem.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thanks a lot. This is nice. Okay, well, cool. So, and I'm realizing I'm in shadow, so I'm gonna just adjust camera for a sec. Isn't that great for the recording and everybody's time? Thanks. So I'm here to basically talk about the I think you are probably familiar with the security audit working group. We ran the first security audit of Kubernetes, and that included building up a threat model. So a number of people in this call were donated their time and helped with that threat model. We really appreciate it. We found a lot out of doing the security audits, and we realized that there was more. There's certainly more for us to do and more to be done outside of just carrying in bugs and saying, hey, these are vulnerabilities that can go into the PSC will start managing, announcing and fixing. So we've had wider conversations and had a good number of people join in, and a lot of that energy started when we gave a talk at KubeCon, and we just had a lot of security folks who were saying, like, how do I get involved? I'm in particular, how do I get involved if I'm not looking to write code right now? So as we talked, we have a pretty wide group, and there's a letter attached and kind of just talks about some of the different people outside of the folks that had been on the security audit working group to start, who've signed the letter and are part of this effort. So I'm just going to kind of tell you a little bit. I know you can all read, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's in this charter, and then let us discuss. So. We have actually 4 members of the product security committee have helped build this charter, and so we've had a lot of talks about what we can do, on what we can take on, to do either for or with the PSC. And so part of the early conversation was the public bugs, the ones that aren't embargoed. We can help with that. We can help set how the private fix and release process is set up, how the vulnerabilities are rated. Not run the bug bounty, but help define its scope, what goes in scope and out of scope. Working on basically, how vulnerabilities are announced, and then what's the criteria in the process for supporting Kubernetes sub-projects. The examples we cited here were dashboard, Nginx, Ingress, the Nginx Ingress, and the COPS installer. The next part of this is actually kind of one of the biggest, and the thing that I'd like to really share is the idea of our proposal for SIG security is very focused on cross-cutting. We're not focused on code ownership. So security community management and outreach. The idea is we've talked to some of the folks who we talked to. Sorry, apparently I'm nervous. So one of the things we want to do is just is help handle the questions that come in from inexperienced users, whether that's directing to the SIGs or serving as a kind of cache for before you go and ask those questions of the SIG that's had to answer them 15 times. We can give you an answer, and eventually that means that'll probably lead to us helping out on documentation, whether that's the actual Kubernetes documentation or security-related docs, which I'll come to next. So the biggest thing, I think in a lot of ways, the biggest thing in this section and one of the biggest things on this page is to provide an entry point for new contributors who are interested in security. And the way we see it, like part of what we found as we've done the security audits, is that kind of activity brings a lot of interest from traditional InfoSec people, and so our hope is that we can basically give them a place to talk, a place to ask questions, to get routed to SIGs, or to help with the things that aren't specifically writing code or writing docs. So I think that's honestly one of the biggest parts of this is that outreach work and community management. Let's see the next couple. So horizontal security documentation. This is something that I'm really proud of, that I'm really excited about, and that is there are two things in here that are really important. One is the threat model. It's basically keeping that threat modeling process going. And the other is basically security benchmarks or hardening guide. And two of the people in our group are Liz Rice and Rory McCune, who run the CIS Kubernetes benchmark for CIS. And they're really excited about coming and basically building a hardening guide, a benchmark here in the Kubernetes project in the open instead of on CIS's web portal with only the people who came to contribute to CIS. They're really excited about doing that through GitHub and doing that in the Kubernetes project, and thus giving the Kubernetes project a lot more ability to influence the CIS guide. Because if there is an official Kubernetes guide, then the CIS guide will definitely be, wow, to reuse the word, influenced. We've also there are a couple folks who were working on the security docs on the security docs sub-project under SIG docs. It was starting to sputter out a little bit, and they were really excited actually about making this a sub-project of SIG security, because in their mind it's a heck of a lot easier to find security people who can write than to find documentation people who have security as a subject matter expertise. And so the other big part of that horizontal security documentation. And then the last part's the security audit that we've been doing already. And basically, we're saying we'd like to have that become part of a wider mission for a security SIG. So we've defined below a few sub-projects to start. One's, of course, the ongoing third-party security audit. Another is security documents and documentation. And that documents is meant to mean things like hardening guides and such that aren't part of the how to use and how to, here's how pod security policies work. That's the documentation for pod security policies, but rather that kind of hardening guide. And the other sub-project for us was is focused on community discussion groups, making sure that we're providing more focused, and also just more contributors to help, because Kubernetes is certainly growing, and it's just, I swear, in a lot of ways, it's only in the last couple of years really started to attract the attention of the InfoSec, kind of the InfoSec community at large. They're still learning, and they're still trying to figure out how they can. They're trying to figure out how they can help. They're also trying to figure out how they can wrap their brain around it. And I think the Kubernetes project is going to see a ton of them coming as a lot of the good talks happen at the mainstream security conferences. So I think that's the best way for me to run down what our charter is. We've talked to a few people here already, but our focus in coming here today is to basically do hopefully a little bit better than just posting on your mailing list. Come out and talk to the group. So you've got a couple people here besides me who are who worked on this charter. One's Micah, and Tim's been here as well. I think the other thing I want to highlight is people have asked, well, wait, if there's another SIG, is that another meeting that people at sig-auth have to go to? And we wanted to be really clear that no, you don't have to come to our meetings. We're not giving you another meeting. Our job will be to come to you. Our job will be to come to you if somebody starts a conversation about making a different default in code. It's time for us to go and talk to sig-auth about what that, about the arguments pro and against. If there are, just like I've heard on this call about, conversations over API and so on, we'll be having to go and walk around to the other SIGs, and that's just the way we see it. I think I didn't cover this out of scope section. I think it's actually really important. So first and foremost, we don't expect to own any of the Kubernetes project, any of the code that goes into a running cluster. If we have code, it may be for helping manage the vulnerability announcement and management process. It might be, but it's not going to be code that goes in a cluster. It's not going to be code that's required in order to run a cluster. Another example would be that if we were to say create a benchmarking tool that checked against the Kubernetes hardening guide, these are the things you got, these are the things that you don't have. That would be code we might own. There are, I think that Tim and Micah can talk to you about some of the other examples if you ask us, and trying to look at anything else on the out of scope that's really useful to share.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please. Thank you. I'm really happy to stop monologuing.
So I see that like out of scope is like cloud provider specific or distribution specific hardening guides. I guess like as an individual, who's like, if I was new to Kubernetes and I wanted to like make sure my Kubernetes was hardened, right? Like I could certainly follow a guide and try to like very carefully make sure, like, let's pretend I don't want to buy something. I just want to run,
Sure.
right? How would I know that I was successful in my hardening, right? Like part of the reason people like lean on this bit right here is it's someone else's problem, and like you pay them to assure you that the hardening has been done. So like I I understand that you guys don't want to own code. Would you, is like, I don't know, a test harness code? Is that like, does that count as code? Like, could you have like a, run this little suite against your cluster and it will echo back if you have success?
I think that's exactly the kind of code we would want to own. I think that in getting the benchmarks that have happened outside with CIS or with other groups to actually have something in the Kubernetes project, I think that it's very naturally going to be that there's then an open source that there's open source code to check against a doc. And I think an easy way to say it, an easy way to think about it is Liz Rice over Liz Rice is both a maintainer on the CIS benchmark and a author and maintainer on KubeBench, the tool for checking, one of the open source tools for checking against that benchmark. Not to sign her up for more work, but I think that the folks that are writing the hardening guide are going to be especially interested in there being a tool. I know that I'll be very interested. I wrote CIS's original Linux and Unix auditing tools that audited each of the Unices. This was a long time ago, obviously, since there were other Unices, but audited previous DHBUX and AIX and each of the Linux distributions. I'll also say that the cloud provider specific or distributor specific hardening guides, I think that's a place where I want to say that I think that's a soft one. If it turns out, trying to think of like, if I think about distributor specific, when I look at installers, and if I look at installers or open source distributions, is that those that are the most popular will end up almost certainly either ending up in scope or in demand to be in scope for hardening guides and for checking tools.
I guess maybe a different way of asking that is like if the SIG cloud provider or some of the maintainers of particular distributions wanted to collaborate to say like, here's sort of the recommended hardening. We understand that you don't have the expertise or the desire or the staffing to manage those guides, but we're interested in contributing that. Like, would that be something you would welcome, or would you say, oh, nope, like we must keep this documentation totally neutral and never mention anything that has a trademark associated with it, or like, because that discussion has come up for some of the documentation.
Oh, sure.
I'm curious, like, yeah, where you would envision that landing.
So there's a certain extent to which I can speak for a group, and a certain extent to which I'm, you have to realize you get into my personal opinion. So I want to now say that we're headed a bit into my personal opinion, and I may be pretty outspoken at times, but I don't want to make any promises for anyone in that way. So I would say, so you've got if you had cloud provider. Can we nail this down to thinking about either cloud providers or I think about OpenShift as kind of a product, as it were. Can we make our question more specific to one of those just to make it a little bit easier to reason? Going through it.
Can I jump in, Jay?
Yeah.
So I think this isn't a question that's specific to security, unique to security. I'm sure this comes up in a lot of other contexts around storage, around SIG cloud provider, around installers. And so I think that I would want to just look towards, like talk to SIG docs, talk to SIG cloud provider, and figure out what the norms around this are for existing documentation, and just try and be consistent with that. If that means each cloud provider gets their own documentation page that they can kind of have some ownership of, or if we have some master list where we link out to cloud provider specific hardening guides. Yeah.
Okay. The other question I had around the horizontal security documentation, it was hard for me to tell sort of how deep that was intended to be? Like, is that down to sort of the operating system level? Like, if you're running this operating system, you really need to set this syscontrol and like turn off this thing and turn on this networking thing and turn off that firewall thing. Like, are you envisioning something all the way down to the OS level?
I don't. Yeah, I mean, I want to say I don't imagine that. However, if I think about, I'm trying to come up with a good example, but it's, if you get into admission control, and there are settings you're suggesting, you'll start to get into the you may end up outside of Kubernetes. An example, I'm trying to think of a decent example, kind of like the.
Here's one. Let's say you want to control set comps, or you want to control which user you run as. Yeah. And that's an important thing for containing your container. But there isn't something on by default in Kubernetes, and probably in the fairly near future won't be something to turn on in Kubernetes at all to control that. Would you mention that sort of control in a horizontal security documentation?
I have to, this is my opinion, and Tim or Micah, please contradict me at will. Like you've just named a couple really clear, clear ones that I think make it into any hardening guide, right? So it's hard to talk about, in my mind, it's hard to talk about hardening Kubernetes without ending up in kind of the full gambit of, the pod security policy, of admission control in general. And so, yeah, if there's an OS setting or a container runtime setting that has to be set in order to permit that, admission control, and some, in somewhat granular admission control recommendations, then yeah, I think we have to comment on it. We have to write a how-to on it.
I think there's sort of three different types of settings that could kind of come into play there. One is what David just mentioned, is like there's a feature that Kubernetes can take advantage of if it's enabled in the kernel. So we might say, like, you need to choose, you can choose between SE Linux or AppArmor. If you have user namespaces enabled, then we don't do anything with it, unfortunately, but maybe someday we will. So there's those kind of like features we can take advantage of. Then there's features that kind of have more interaction or implications of with Kubernetes. I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was a recent vulnerability around IPv6 masquerading, and there's a setting that you can flip on. I think there's sorry,
setting.
Yeah, syscuttle on the Ethernet adapter to kind of block that attack vector. That's pretty specific to the Kubernetes networking setup. So that I could also see in the hardening guide. And then you get into the like general like Linux hardening of like, how to manage your SSH credentials. And that's the sort of thing that I would say is probably more out of scope.
That's my opinion too. Like, I know I didn't answer that part of your question, Jordan, but yeah, if we're talking about, how do you manage your SSH credentials? What goes, what do you do with host.allow for things that are, compiled against librap and so on? I think that stays out of scope, and because I think you're honestly, just from a workload perspective, because just doing a complete hardening guide for a Linux distribution, it's a reasonable amount of effort, and then you get into differences between distros.
Also, as a more meta comment, this is a proposal around starting up a kind of new subcommunity to talk about these sorts of questions and to figure these things out. And so I imagine like that'll be part of SIG security subproject, security docs subproject is defining what's in scope for the docs. So we're sort of laying out kind of the broad scope here, but then I would expect a lot more discussion to happen after.
Yeah, I think the thing I'm trying to figure out is, like, if this is a SIG that is primarily oriented around like discussion and best practices and communication and like documenting hardening guides and coming up with maybe tests to verify you follow the hardening guide, but it doesn't actually own the code that a lot of those things depend on. I'm just trying to imagine how those discussions, like if a discussion happens and consensus emerges, but then like at what point are the various teams, sig-node or sig-auth or API machinery or whoever, like if consensus emerges before the SIGs are involved, then do you have to re-have those conversations? And if you get the SIGs involved as part of building that consensus, it sounds like just another like multi-SIG meeting time. Maybe I'm pessimistic.
I'm somewhat worried about the same thing. Like I'm thinking through things like it would be really good if there was a way to limit the number of IOPS a particular container could have, as an example of a problem that we've seen bite people. And if you try to have that discussion without sig-node and without cryo, I'm not really sure how you would fix it.
Not to discourage the goal. Like I think the things that are called out here are things that have either been neglected or haven't been coordinated well. I'm just trying to think practically, like what would this look like? Would it look like here's a list of topics we want to tackle, and we'll set up a particular meeting where we're going to talk through this and make sure the right people are there as part of that? What I want to avoid is like SIG security becoming like someone assumes, oh, well, we talked about it in SIG security and no one voiced opposition, so everybody must agree, like this is the way. And then like all the various people who are actually responsible for making it happen are like, wait, what? I didn't even know this meeting was happening.
Like all SIG security formed consensus on was that they wanted to open a PR.
Right.
I would say so. Tim, I hope you'll help me out here if I flounder in this question. But in my mind, until the relevant SIGs that own the code are involved in the conversation isn't finished, right? It's kind of the some part of this is, listen, every bit of like we've looked at 2 hardening guides. We've written the Kubernetes official, we think we should write in the official Kubernetes hardening guide that you should do X. Well, gosh, that one of the very next questions that anybody'd have is, well, why isn't this the default? And, of course, part of what we're going to do is say, dude, changing defaults is a lot harder than, you think. But another part is it's time for us to come to each of the relevant SIGs and say, this is what's getting talked about. This is what's happening in the hardening guides. What's the first? What do you see as the what's going to break when we try to do that? When people try to set that setting, we can think of this, but you're right, as you say, you're writing the code and planning the code, and then second, hey, can this become a default? And to basically, for lack of a better verb, lobby the SIGs that own the code for moving defaults. But I think until the SIGs that own the code are involved in the conversation, it's not over. But man, I think we can save you a lot of effort. I think we can save you a lot of, like imagine that conversation's finished. What's come out of that conversation is you can't do that. It will break X. Once that's been done, we can handle that question, like we can handle that debate 6 months later when new people join and say, but why aren't you doing X? It's no, you can't do X. sig-auth has told us this because, I don't know, that's part of the other, I think that's part of where I'm going.
Two things I'd like to add to that. One, Jay mentioned this earlier, but we really see it as part of the responsibility of SIG security to reach out to the other SIGs. And so to show up at SIGNode and say like, hey, we're working on this hardening guide. Here's some of the things that we've thought of. Like, is there stuff we're missing? Are there issues with this? And get input from the other SIG communities. And then the other piece of it is just kind of from a pragmatic standpoint, these discussions are already happening, and they're happening outside of the Kubernetes community today. They're happening in, outside of the, SIG community. Kubernetes is a broader community, but like, this is already happening through the CIS project, and in kind of like hallway tracks and other discussions. There isn't a clear gathering point for these within the Kubernetes community. And so the idea is to kind of like bring that into the sort of official Kubernetes community structure, and then also encourage that outreach to the other SIGs through that process.
One thought I just had that might be it doesn't need to go in the charter or anything, but just a way of thinking about it. If there's a change that someone wants to propose, like actually going through the KEP process, at least in the like, this is what I want to do and why. Like, there's a lot of stuff in that template. Like, don't worry about the rest of the template, but this is what I want to do and why. And identifying the SIG or SIGs that would be involved in that would probably be a good thing to get used to doing, especially for something like SIG security, which is almost exclusively in that sort of communication and coordination role. And what that lets us do is avoid sort of lengthy discussions and debates and consensus building before the actual stakeholders are really involved. So it identifies like, what do you want to do? Why do you want to do it? Who are the SIGs that need to be involved? And it, like, writing is a really good exercise. It makes you figure out what you really mean. And it also gives us sort of a place of record where if what you want to do and why isn't going to work, we can document that and then decline the KEP. Like, that's not something we really do. It's technically part of the KEP process, but I think that would be really useful to sort of get a written history of here are things people wanted to do and why it was declined. So yeah, that just occurred to me that would be a good thing.
I think that's really great. It also means that that caching function too. It also means that when the third KEP comes in on very much the same thing, because I swear as you get more InfoSec people coming to the project, you're going to get a bunch of repeat, and you can say, let's reference this one.
Yeah. So my feedback on this is that I think these areas are underserved today, and I'm happy to see someone paying attention to them. I know how much overhead there is in sort of a SIG structure, and so one of the questions that I asked the folks proposing this was, are you concerned about that overhead? As long as the people who would be bearing the brunt of that overhead feel like it's worth it, I don't particularly object. But I just wanted to call that out as a consideration. And then the other thing that I think there will be some confusion over is just the name. I think people will associate SIG security with, like, this SIG has the final say on everything security related. Like, they can, dictate whatever. And I see that it's baked into the charter, like it's clear, but people won't read the charter. They'll hear, oh, SIG security. SIG security said this isn't okay, therefore, da-da-da-da-da. So
that is a point of confusion on the CNCF SIG security.
Yeah, I will promise you both that I will write something, that I will submit a pull request on our README should we be accepted, that specifically says that we're not the decision-making body, and talks about the SIGs and the governance structure, because we may often be, for security, the first place people go when they have something to say, and that means we're going to be that means that we're gonna have an education mission, and part of that, like, we're gonna have an education mission to tell them, well, hey, this is what this is what the KEP is. This is what the KEP process is. Here's how you can create a KEP. Here's how you can look at the ones that already exist, so you're not necessarily suggesting something that's already been done, without reading everything that's gone into why that's not happening. I'm trying to remember that was kind of a two-part. So the overhead of managing a SIG. So I can speak for the people who are involved in this, especially for the leads on the security audit working group. Our working group has been a heck of a lot of work, and we're really we feel like we have a pretty good picture of that overhead, and we're willing to do it. The cool thing has been that there's been enough energy that's come out of the community so far, that we're not short on people who want to help and are willing to who are willing to help shoulder that overhead side. There's one thing I didn't speak about in here. It's not really all that written into our charter, but it's implied. And that was in, can we scroll up just slightly? That's in that security community management and that security outreach. And while it's called outreach, we also know that part of what we'll be seeing is some of the incoming conversations with people who aren't looking to immediately contribute to the project, but want to get conversations started, about, whether it's been the most recent vulnerability in Kubernetes or some other security matter. And we at one point we had in our charter, like, okay, we just cleared it out of the bullets to make the charter shorter, but we'll take incoming questions from press and public, about Kubernetes security. And obviously a lot of those go to the PSC, but one of the people who's on the charter, one of the people who's signed our letter and worked on the charter here is Ian, who was really clear with us and said, listen, if you think you can walk away from having to be an incoming channel for press or public questions, yeah, you're probably, we're probably wrong. And part of what they said was, right now on security, the reporters basically either call the people on the PSC who were part of announcing a vulnerability, or they call the 3 or 4 people they know. And so Ian is part of our group, and Ian's handling, I would say Ian's handling a ton of the incoming public and press inquiries. So maybe this will help spread that effort around.
Well, I'll say I was glad to see that the charter was very clear that ownership for the code stayed with the SIGs, that they'd be contacted about the security documentation, that you would find them. That's all good. I had one minor comment about the out of scope section. I would really like to see, for each of the things that are out of scope, who actually owns them.
Sure.
You did it for some of them, but not for all. And if we don't have owners for the things that are out of scope, I would worry about scope creep.
I think we can fix that. I think one thing I'm noting is there's not, perhaps when we copy this from Google Drive to GitHub, to Markdown, we didn't end up indenting some of these bullets that were indented in Google Drive. So like the embargoed vulnerability management, bug bounty, submission triage, non-public vulnerability collection disclosure, those are all meant to be indented under the bullet above, private vulnerability response, that ends with a colon. So it's meant to be a list, and I think that's our I'm just going to call that our typo and not indenting it. And then I think the only other things that don't have something listed, we better fix that. So any projects outside of the Kubernetes project, um, at maybe we're referring that to CNCF SIG security, or cloud provider specific or distributor specific hardening guides. We've talked about how that's soft, but that would probably be see your distributor or cloud provider. And then recommendations or endorsements being out of scope is honestly, I don't know what we'd put in parentheses there. We could put something snarky, but I think we're just stuck with, that's our way of trying to say that that we're not king making.
Fine. There were a half dozen that I noticed, and if it's just
Yeah.
the implementation and formatting, then that's great.
Yeah, I think it's our fault, and it's probably my fault because I was the one who copied the Google Drive. Thanks, David. I'll fix it. My bad.
Since we only have a few minutes left, is there, from any of the SIG-Leads or really anyone on the call, is there any concerns with this moving forward? I think we've talked about it in the past some. I think I generally agree with Jordan that this is a good idea and someone should hopefully own this. I am wary about the name. I know it implies things in people's heads. At the same time, like SIG security docs or SIG security guides sounds really lame, to be very honest. But I don't know what more we can do other than document that very clearly, as Jay has mentioned.
Both documenting it and acting on it. So making sure that not only is it documented that, like, if decisions need to be made, it needs to go through this process. Like, you need to propose a specific thing and get the right groups involved, but then actually sticking to that and saying, like, if someone wants to make a proposal, that's great. Like, we can help you find the right people to get involved and start working through that. So yeah, and it sounds like the people leading this are committed to doing that. So that's great.
We are.
I was going to ask, Jordan, you had suggested then using like part of the KEP process as like a lightweight way of documenting desired changes and sort of helping folks to be aware. Does that need to be in the charter somewhere?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't think that belongs in the charter. The charter is clear about, like, this is what this group does and this is what the group doesn't do. I think going through the proposed, motivated, and relevant SIG bits of the KEP template would be a great way to, like, execute that, redirecting a specific proposal to the right groups. But that doesn't belong in the charter. That's an implementation detail.
I think we can create some documentation that even takes an example. I'm not promising to do that right now, but I think that we can absolutely create some documentation that creates an example, because that's going to save us a lot of effort, and also I hope continue to build the trust that it sounds like you're expressing for our work, Jordan.
Cool. Does anyone else have further comments, or do we get 3 minutes back? Cool. All right. Well, thanks for attending, everyone. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thanks for letting me speak.